Welcome back to another episode of the Press Sport Podcast. On today's episode, very important topic. So today's topic, we're just going to be talking about, mental health in marginalized communities and kind of what that means and the stigma behind that. And on today's episode, we have a special guest, Sheila Aries. Am I saying that right? The last name right? Did I say that right?
Actually, my first name is pronounced Shayla because it's
Shayla.
Spanish,
Okay.
but yeah, so Shayla Arias, yes.
Sheila Arias. Okay, so I'll let you introduce yourself to let the people know who you are, your area of expertise, and things like that. So,
Yeah, so I'm Shayla Arias. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, state of New York and New Jersey. Um, I work with different populations, but a lot of my expertise has been with the immigrant population, particularly children and youth. For post grad, I've done a lot of couples, BIPOC communities, LGBTQ communities, marginalized communities, as this episode is going to be about. And yeah, I'm all about relationships and systems. So as we go into it, that's the framework that I have when it comes to mental health and any symptoms that come up for most individuals and families.
gotcha, gotcha. So, I mean, you guys heard the expertise, but yeah, I'll just start off with the first question. So, what are some factors that you feel like contribute to mental health concerns in marginalized communities?
There's a lot, right? But a few of them, of course, is poverty, right? Financial hardships. It's a huge one. And whenever there's spaces of financial hardships, there's lack of resources, which means um, there isn't the support in schools for children or in workplaces, discrimination, community violence,
Yeah,
immigration status, right? So that's a big one that sometimes we're not aware of. And lack of safety, right? And when I say safety, not only physical safety, but emotional safety as well, particularly with children. And then we can somehow go into how that, transitions into adulthood.
and in the work that you do, how do you kind of see that affecting some of the individuals that you work with on a day-to-day basis?
So when clients reach out, consultation, emails, the same way as you reach out to me through psychology today, I get a lot of, hey, I've been experiencing depression and anxiety, right? These are the two symptoms. I like to say symptoms. Yeah, there is a clinical diagnosis of it. I don't like to pathologize a lot of these things because depression and anxiety are part of the human experience.
Right,
They're emotions just like excitement,
right,
happiness, anger, right, etc. So with that being said, when I get that, I'm always curious of the root cause, or at least what's happening in this individual or this couple or this family's lives that is contributing to the symptoms, right? So cultural narratives, racial, socioeconomic, right, gender narratives. These are all factors that I always ask questions and I become curious in, because we're part of systems, right? We're either
right.
part of a biological family, we're part of a community, we're part of educational institutions, right? We're part of systems within our work. Um, and because of that, there's always other things that connect, and it's not just the individual. So that's why I say I'm a relational systemic
Yes.
therapist, because I know that individuals are part of something bigger. Um, so with that being said, going back to I guess the original question is that's how some of the things come up for the clients that reach out and that I work with. In seeing how it's not just the individual, right? There's more than that that can be impacting, like I said, with poverty, right? Crime, community violence, but even deeper, right? Discrimination, immigration status, gender is a big one, right? And I
Yeah.
think that follows up um, to the next few questions, but particularly, I think the lack of safety. And this is a lot of, yes, the physical aspect, but more the emotional too.
Yeah, so you touched on a lot of different things there. You talked about, racial discrimination being a contributing factor. You talk about financial or the lack of financial resources being a factor in mental health. So these are all things that you see on a day-to-day basis when in marginalized communities or communities that have people of minority or just people who don't have those resources, right? And one of the things that it's been shown that Black women experience higher levels of mental health conditions, but yet they aren't the ones that are seeking the help that they need. Why is that? Why do you feel that is?
This idea that we have to have our together, right? As women, particularly women of color, showing any sign of vulnerability, quote unquote, equates to weakness,
Oh, yeah,
and to be able to not put ourselves out there. Um, we think we have to figure it out by ourselves, right? Not seeking out support from either close loved ones, right, friends, um, but also accessibility, right? It not being accessible. Yes, more now, but I think there's still a lot of work that has to go on, which, later on we can go more into details. But particularly, I think women of color, it goes back to this idea that we need to have it figured out on our own. And because of that, there's this fear, right, of reaching out for support. Or the idea, right, the stigma that therapy is for crazy people, or you
mm,
need to have a deep, like, psychological problem. At least, like, I'm Dominican, right? So in Dominican Republic, there's no such thing as really, yeah, there's like couples therapists and stuff, but for the most part, it's like psychiatrists and psychologists.
yeah,
So no one really seeks out help when there's like huge behavior issues or very psychological issues, not just life stressors, right, and things like that. So that's the next layer of it is the fact that there's a stigma of if I'm reaching out, then I must be crazy. But not only that, I've been taught that my problems is either I resolve it on my own or with my family. Like a stranger shouldn't know my issues.
got you, got you. And even in that, I was just thinking while you was talking, for even when you're coming from these communities, they're not the education about mental health is not you're not getting that education in the first place. So how do they even how do they recognize some of these signs? Because sometimes they could be exhibiting like certain signs of like depression or anxiety, but they don't know what to actually call it. There's no name to call it, you know. So how do you feel like how do from what you've seen with the people that you work with, um, are they able to label what they're feeling and are they able to give it like a meaning? You know, do you get what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I definitely do. I mean, I think one amazing thing, it's very, I'm saying amazing because it has its pros, but then there's its cons, is social media, right? And
Mhm.
just access to the internet where before, again, you would have to go to a doctor's office and get like these clinical terms and whatnot. But now there's so much resources, free resources out there. So when I do get clients, right, that reach out, they have an idea of what they're feeling because either they've Googled their symptoms, like what
Yeah,
they're feeling, like what their thoughts, right, racing thoughts, what they're feeling in their body. And then it's like, oh, you have generalized anxiety disorder or major depressive disorder. And I'm like, nope, that's not what you have. You're a person who's experiencing depression, right, again, due to X, Y, and Z, right? And that's where I come in to explore with them what's happening within their lives currently, but also going back. Um, so yes, the fact that the internet is so accessible, many are able to point out, particularly right, the newer generations, Gen Z, they're so woke, as we
yeah,
know, millennials. But I've also had the privilege to work with older folks and they're also open, right? The ones that have been more taught um, to not seek out help due to again, right, the accessibility of the internet and just having this information, they're able to slowly become more comfortable of I can get help. I don't have to try to do this on my own because I've tried, right, in so many
yeah,
different ways
yeah.
and nothing has worked. So for the most part, yes, they're able to identify or at least share what is happening because just the free resources that are out there now. And I think just the conversations that are happening more and more within communities.
And also you said one of the things was accessibility. How do they close that gap? How do you then bridge that gap between now getting people the access that they need? Because it's not most of the people that need the help, they can't get the help. So how do you feel like what are some things that you in place, or even just ideas. Obviously, we can't change it all on our own. You know what I mean? But
Boy, we're gonna spend 2 hours talking about this. No, I'm kidding. It's interesting you're saying that because one thing I've learned throughout my personal journey as a therapist is we're in the helping field, right?
yeah,
Because we're in the helping field, sometimes there's this idea that we have to do this out of the kindness of our hearts.
still gotta get paid. But
Exactly. No. I'm going to go into that,
yeah,
right? It's we have to do this out of the kindness of our hearts, right? How dare you charge X amount of money, whatever. Yes, but I went through excessive training. I have some student loans, right? Like I need to support my family. Like I'm a mom of two, right? I have my family to support. I deserve to get paid well, right? To because of the steps, right? We don't ask doctors like, how come you're charging this, right?
right. Right.
We're in the same field, right? But because mental health is still pretty new if you think about it compared to like the physical health and all that, we're still under the medical model. And being able to again just reframe that narrative is important. And accessibility looks so many different ways. Systems, right? I mentioned like systems is a big thing for me, is being able to dismantle just the medical system because insurance companies don't like to pay. That's the reality, right? And if you don't have some great insurance that you're paying a lot of money for, most likely you're going to have a tough time. And if you do have accessibility to reach out to specific therapists or community centers, what happens? These therapists are burnt out because they have 30 to 50 clients.
Right.
That's not sustainable, right? For our own mental health.
Right.
Burnout is real in our field, and a lot of therapists end up leaving after 2 or 3 years of just starting off the work because of that.
Right.
So, accessibility is a bigger monster.
Mm.
And I know I'm sure you've read or you've heard conversations just of, right, on the client side of, I can't afford therapy, I can't do that. But at the same time, for therapists, particularly that have their own business, we have to kind of have that mentality because we know what goes into it. Because even
Yeah.
once we're licensed, we still have to continue trainings, right,
Right.
to keep up our licensure. So it's still investment. And charging X amount of money, right, to make it quote unquote cheaper is not sustainable,
Yeah.
right? So it's a bigger monster on top of us, and hopefully someday we're able to get maybe not completely close the gap, but start,
Yeah.
diminishing and getting it closer where everyone can have right access to mental health services, but also the therapists on the other end are able to make a fair wage.
Right. And sliding scale is a thing though, right? Don't some therapists do sliding scale payments and things like that. But even then it's like, does that help individuals who still don't, are able to get the help that they need?
Yes and no, because then that means a therapist who has sliding scale most likely has a certain amount of slots, but then has other clients who are paying more to kind of compensate.
Got you.
Right.
Got you.
So yeah, sliding scales. There's I know like Open Path is an organization that's really good that they charge a certain amount, right, per session, and it becomes more accessible. But at the end of the day, it's about insurance companies, um, not only what they're paying, but paying the therapist on time. Because I can see you today, but sometimes I won't see the actual money from your session until 2 weeks later, or
Yeah.
even 3, or even months, because it takes them time to process claims. And that's the part that, right, the day-to-day person doesn't know. And it's not about that I have to give you this information when you start working with me, but I hope that information is also put out there that we're not charging X amount of money because we want to get rich off of this. It's because we're in a double bind.
Yeah. So even for people when they want to look out and reach out for a therapist, what does that process look like? How do I find a therapist? How do I find somebody who understands me? How does that process look?
I mean, the process is different for everyone, right? If you want someone who looks like you, right? For the most part, that's something that we all want, right? Where you have some idea of
Yeah.
my story. Is there's sites like Therapy for Black Girls, um, what's the other side? I always forget. But like psychology today, you can put filters, right? You're able to do that and then put your insurance. Because when you call your insurance and they'll give you a whole list of providers,
Yeah,
but most of the time that list is not up to date. So either you have therapists that aren't practicing, you don't know what they look like, you don't know if there's a wait list or not, right? It's just a
yeah,
name and a number.
yeah.
So that's hard. But again, going back to the having the internet and just having these platforms, it helps to get more of a sense of who am I looking for, right? And through these profiles, you're able to see the framework that the therapist uses, what they look like, um, if they take insurance, if not, if it's out of network benefits, right? Like all these different things. So essentially, Google, right,
Yeah.
the
Okay.
internet really helps in this. And word of mouth, right? If you have, you know, colleagues, friends, right, who are in therapy, they always can recommend because I've got clients like that too.
Okay. And so, how important would you say it is to have culturally competent care?
Super important. Um, hold on. I say super important because, at least for me, I'm not going to speak for anyone else.
Hmm.
The most important thing for me when working with my clients is having a trusting relationship. If you don't trust me as a client, it's going to be very hard for us to go into places that is required, right, to really create this healing process. So building trust and rapport with my clients is essential.
Hmm.
And having the knowledge of the narratives, right, that have shaped my clients' experience is very important. Obviously, I'm not going to know every single culture out
Yeah,
there,
yeah,
but I'm always willing to learn, right? Not only from the client, because it's not the client's job to tell me, oh, this is what Dominicans do, or this is what Asians do, or whatever, right? That's not their job. But also further educating myself, again, through trainings, goes back to the investment that we continue to do as therapists, and how I can continue to support this client. So it is super important. How
gotcha. And one of the things that I was gonna ask as well was, let's say that you're somebody who's experienced abuse or from a young age, and you're constantly in like a constant state of, anxiety. Um, how does that affect your daily functioning and your long-term functioning overall?
hmm, it affects a lot, right? Because there's plenty of resources out there and just research just how childhood adversities affect the brain, the physical body, right? And because it affects our physiological, we get triggered easily, right? So you might not be thinking about an experience that you not, had as a kid, but your body will, right? There's this great book. I always forget the author, but it's called The Body Keeps Score.
Mm.
And because of
It's the
that,
blue book, right? It's like a blue.
yes, and there's
Okay.
there's a worksheet like
Okay.
worksheet book too as well. But with that, the body keeps score. It means essentially, right? If you grew up in an environment where there was so much stress, really high stress, your body had to get used to that, right? And although you grew up, you maybe moved out of that environment and everything, anything that resembles, right, that spacing, your body's going to remember, right? I'm just like, I don't know why I'm so shaky or I'm hypervigilant or like my body's tense.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, your brain is not able to process a lot of that, but your body is, right? And that somatic part is super important, particularly for individuals who have experienced a lot of trauma, right? Physical, sexual abuse. Um, and I do recommend if I do get any clients to get some of that work or I refer out, right? Because I'm not a somatic, my expertise is not in somatic work, but I do work with them to learn coping skills, right? And also using the space to process a lot of this, right? So yes, constant state of action, anxiousness affects daily lives and long term, right? Um, because aside from that, this child also learned how to cope with these stressors. And most of the time, these coping mechanisms aren't sustainable. right? It worked as a child. This is either let me hide under my bed, right? Let me disassociate, right? If my dad is screaming at me or whatever the case may be, let me zone out, all of these things. But as we become older, these behaviors look different, right? The numbing, the avoidance, the running away is not sustainable.
So would you say that's
So,
more, sorry, I'm sorry to cut you off. Would
no,
you
no,
say
go
that's
ahead.
more so a survival thing rather than having actual tools?
Yes, so it's a survival, right? It's a coping mechanism. It's
Yeah.
destructive, it's not a constructive one, but it is a survival, right? That I love the word you use because it is a survival mechanism, right? That we all, I think all humans for the most part, learn depending on our experience, right? Throughout childhood and adolescent years, how to cope with things. But then as we get older, we start to see how those coping mechanisms, survival mechanisms no longer function, right? They don't serve us. So then we have to learn new ones. And we have to be aware of how they show up because for the most part, they're going to be pretty automatic. I've been, right. I've been ghosting people when I'm dating all the time. And that's
Yeah.
because what I've been doing most of my dating life,
Yeah.
then that requires a lot of pausing and awareness, right? To make sure I can call that behavior out and ask and become curious of how come I'm doing this, right? Um, I'm all about family of origin work, so I use a lot of that framework
Yeah.
in working with my clients of what were these behaviors look like within your family system, right? What did you do as a kid when you would see fighting or anything that was scary, right? Kind of going into that mix of figuring out how this survival mechanism, right, was constructed essentially.
So even in raising their awareness, how do you get an individual to even like how do you raise an individual's awareness to know like when they're behaving a certain way that it's more so survival or maybe how do you get them to reframe the way they go about certain behaviors in the work
Well,
that
I
you
asked them, mhm. Well, one, that's why the building rapport and trust is so important.
yeah.
And I like to use the word, and some of my clients laugh because humor is super important to me too in our work. Is I think I'm going to call out bullshit, right?
Okay.
Especially so, like a lot of my clients are like women of color, mid 20s, 30s, right, who are dating and all of that. And as we know, the way we behave and the things we learn from my family system shows up in our romantic relationships because
Definitely.
they're both intimate relationships. So as I start hearing stuff, I'm like, can I call out something, right? And then I'll call out the behavior. And then with calling out the behavior, I'll start asking questions to really bring in the client into becoming curious. But how come you think you thought this? Right? Because essentially, in our past sessions, you've been telling me that you want to show up this way, right?
Yeah.
So I really invite them in, and that has them like, you're right. I wonder why I did that. I did that because of this reminded me of a past partner, right? Or I was very anxious, and to protect myself, I end up like ghosting, right, and avoiding, and
Yeah.
etc. So awareness is being able to question and kind of challenge this thought, right? And when I use the word challenge, it's not like, hey, so what are you doing that, right?
Yeah.
It's more like I really want you to become curious of that behavior or that thought process, right? How come this and not this, right? And I always start to suggest, right, based on what they've informed me, and how can we start to reframe that? So it's calling out, for lack of a better term, right? Kind of bring, because that's my job, is if I see patterns, I'm going to call them out because that's part of the awareness process.
And like you
And the
said,
awareness,
you guys have built that connection with each other to where you can actually call them out on
yeah,
that
I'm not going to do that
bullshit.
with the
Yeah,
client
yeah,
that
yeah.
we've been, yeah, for the most part, if we've been working like what, 3, 6 months, no, this is like long term. So individual therapy for me is pretty long term with clients,
Yeah.
versus maybe like couples. But yeah, it's after a while, and I start to sense, right, if this client, right, and I might use the word bullshit, but I might say like, hey, can I pause you? I've been tracking some of patterns, right, and
Yeah.
I want to bring this out because I saw this, right. This sounds like it really resembles the dynamic you had with like your mom or your dad, right? So I can also frame it that way. So it depends on right the relationship I have with my client, but I am pretty confident in myself to still call out but just the way I do it just differs on the client.
Okay, got you. Got you. And what are some practical things that maybe an individual can do on their own to, I guess, raise their level of awareness?
I mean, I'm sure you've heard this journaling, right? It's such a like cliche, but writing is such a powerful tool, right?
Yeah.
Because as we know, our minds, I don't know what the number is. I see we have only a few minutes left, so I'll talk quickly. We have a million thoughts that go through our minds. And if we engage with all of them, that's what causes the overthinking and the anxiousness, right? Because our brain is like on overload. So being able to release it, right? That's why talk therapy is also effective because you're processing. Um, the writing is so effective because you're able to see what's happening in your minds. And then you get to ask yourself questions based on whatever you wrote, right? And you're able to go deeper into that. So, like, I do provide a lot of journal prompts to clients to do in between sessions to sit with themselves based on what's happened in their mind, but also on what we spoke about in session and kind of reflecting and connecting the two. So, writing is a big tool that I highly suggest, if not all, but most of my clients. To sit with themselves, right? And start reflecting and like, like you said, bring up that awareness on their own as well. Because sometimes they're able to connect dots that us two can in session.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's helpful.
Okay. And I guess you said the time and everything, so I just want to be cognizant of the time. So, um, what are a bit of advice, or usually how we end the show is leaving the audience with one piece of advice. So, what would that advice be to people? What would you like to leave with the audience?
I'm not too fond of the word advice, but I use suggestion.
Suggestion, okay, suggestion.
Yeah, it's scary, right? And I know many of us, depending on our cultural, right, gender backgrounds, all these different factors, asking for help is scary, but it's the best thing we can do is investing in ourselves. And mental health is that. We invest in the stock market, we invest in relationships, we invest in buying homes.
Right.
Is that guaranteed? No, right? Because the stock market goes up and down, right? Properties can crash,
Right.
relationships can end. But the investment in yourself is guaranteed because you know you're putting in the work and you're going to see that flourish. So that's one thing. And the next thing is getting out.
You
We
said
need to
getting out.
connect to nature, getting out. So we need to get out. And I say get out is connecting to nature. Like I live in Jersey City, which is New York City essentially, right? If you live in a big city, it's hard, but just stepping out, feeling the fresh air, the sun is so essential. So connecting to the outdoors, however we can, is so essential for our mental health because physically we need that.
I love that. I love that. And you talk about getting outside. I think that's also helpful because I don't think people know, but like you get vitamin D when you get in the sunlight. So that's always good to raise your energy, raise your level. So where can the
Yeah,
people
it
find you?
shifts your moods, like your moods. It stabilizes your moods,
Gotcha.
right? So all of that. Hmm.
So where can the people find you? Where
Well, they can find me at equitytherapy.com, which is the group practice I work for. They can also find me on Psychology Today. And I'm slowly starting to work more on my social media presence. So I won't provide because I don't have one yet. But if we ever meet again, right, I can provide that information. But right now, equity, equity therapy, equitytherapy.com and then Psychology Today, just looking for my name, which is Shayla Arias.
Gotcha. Thank you. I appreciate you for joining me on today's show and have a nice one.
Thank you.